My guest on today's podcast is Miss Janelle Anderson. I can call her Mrs. Anderson because she was my teacher in fifth grade. And wow, one of my takeaways from this conversation is never to assume someone's story ever, ever again. So, who is Janelle Anderson? She is the author of this book, Take Center Stage. She is an author, a certified professional coach, and a renowned speaker. And in this conversation, you'll hear a lot of her story, which is dramatic and shocking in a lot of ways, but at the same time, so relatable of someone who can get through hard times and encourage us all to do the same. So here are some of my notes that I took from the conversation to prime you for what you're about to experience. Number one, ask for spirit nudges. That's what she does in her life, and God speaks to her. Number two is, as I mentioned, never assume someone's story again. I'm just reminded of that over and over. Number three, we can learn how to forgive. And four, we can take center stage. So with that, please enjoy this very heartfelt, very powerful conversation with my old teacher and a mentor of mine who continues to teach me new lessons, Miss Janelle Anderson. There we go. Miss Janelle, cheers. Welcome to the podcast. And actually, I would prefer to call you Mrs. Anderson, having grown up with you. And you and my mom are very good friends. And as we chatted about before clicking record, your daughter, Shauna, and I have the same birthday. She's just 1 year older, but every January 21st, we exchange some text messages and wish each other happy birthday. And we call ourselves diaper buds because we've literally known each other since diapers. And so this is probably one of the first times that I have a guest on the show who has seen me since I've been a diaper. So welcome.
Thank you. Yeah, so that's unusual. That's so amazing, though. It really is. I'm excited to be here. Definitely honored.
Well, and I've got your book, and
Aww.
I've read the first 5 chapters. Take center stage for those that are just listening and not seeing it. But there's a section of your story where you say, quote, "My story is dramatic and shocking to some." And I think you were writing that for people like me who knew you as Mrs. Anderson, who taught my 5th grade class at Dayspring Christian Academy.
Yes. Yes, people like you who only knew me after all of that.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
You have quite the story, and I can't wait to get into it. So I thought we'd start with this, and feel free to take this conversation any direction you want to. What I'm just really thrilled about, and also feeling like a weight of responsibility, is just to get out of the way and let you share your story, because what I want most from this podcast is to inspire others to receive provision from Jesus and to bless and protect others in amazing ways. And your story encapsulates that better than I can. And so, if it's okay with you, can we start with the estate dream? What is the estate dream? And tell us about that.
Yes. So somewhere along along my journey, I believe I had that dream somewhere during the time where I was beginning the process of kind of peeling back the layers on my past, which at that point was 30 years in the past. But I had never dealt with some things in my past, thinking, well, if I just don't talk about it, nobody will ever know. And I can just pretend like none of that ever happened and it won't affect me. Only it did affect me. And I didn't realize it for all that time. And so when that dream happened, I was kind of in that process of God showing me some things like, we really need to go back and visit that and unpack it, peel back the layers so you can be healed, so you can go forward. And I had that dream during that time. Either I was already in the process or he was like wooing me into it. Like, it took a long time for me to agree to actually do it, So when I had this dream, it was somewhere in there. And the dream was that I was coming back from like a big concert or something with my friends. And we came to this big not plantation, I wouldn't say that word, but a big estate. And there was a big mansion on the estate, and it was obviously in disrepair. It was boarded up, broken windows, peeling paint. Like, it was not in very good shape at all. And in the dream, I'm walking into this house thinking, kind of with the realization of, this is my property. I don't remember it. I don't know how that came to be, but it was sort of like this dawning realization that this is my property. And obviously, I haven't lived here in a very long time. And as I'm
Mm.
getting that realization, I'm walking through the house and seeing the peeling paint and trash everywhere, and it's a mess. And my friends are with me, and we go out on the back porch, and out on the property in the backyard there's people that have dug deep holes, and they built fires. They are embedded there. They're living there. I call them squatters. They obviously had been there a very long time. And I realized in the dream, like, I have to get them out of here because this is my property and I'm taking it back. I'm taking back ownership. And so I get out this, first I call the cops to come, and then I get out this megaphone and I start announcing to them, you have to go. And they were like arguing with me and resisting and saying, no, we don't have to go. We've lived here for years. Who are you? You know, like, this is our land. We don't have to go. And I had to keep demanding that they leave. And eventually, one by one, they left. There was one that was really persistent and really dug in deep. And I had to really just battle with that one for a long time. And finally, that one left too. And then the property was all restored. The house was all restored. Everything was beautiful and the way it should be. And I'm standing on the
Mm.
porch with all my friends on the ground below me, and they're cheering me on and clapping. And the feeling I had in that moment in the dream, I could still feel it. It was so powerful. And it was this feeling of complete and total acceptance. Just through and through, like, I felt loved and accepted for who I was. And it was an incredible feeling. I don't know that I'd ever felt that before. And so I wake up from the
Mm.
dream. I'm like, wow, what was that all about? And I start praying about it, and God starts like giving me the download, like, this dream, this is about you. That property is your heart. And you
Mm.
hadn't been living there for a long time. You were not connected to who you really are. And that's why it was all in disrepair. And the squatters represented the lies that had been embedded in my heart, that I had been believing for so long about who I am and about the things that had happened to me and how I saw myself. And they were embedded deeply in my heart. And it took a while to get rid of them, because there's this process that I needed to go through to, first of all, recognize the lies, recognize them for what they are, name them, really repent for believing them, tell them to go, and then restore or replace them with truth. And so I was just beginning this process when I had the dream, but he was showing me, like, this is what we're doing. And your
Mm.
future is this restored, beautiful land, which is your heart. And the acceptance of who you are, like, it's you're going to realize that you're going to walk in that, and you're going to have that confidence in knowing who you truly are, the truth of who you really are. It was such a powerful dream. And I put it in the book because that was the chapter on, uprooting the lies that you've been believing in your life and renewing your mind to the truth. And it's such a powerful picture of that. The reason why I had to pick up the megaphone and call the police, that had to do with authority. I had to take back my own authority, find my own voice, make my stand for myself, and
Mm.
command, those lies to be gone. And sometimes that's what we have to do. We're so used to believing in a certain way and seeing ourselves a certain way based on lots of things that have happened that the enemy likes to remind us of. And he gets a foothold and a stronghold in our lives. And so the work of recognizing them and calling them out for what they are, and tearing them down, tearing down the strongholds, and then speaking the truth. You have to be able to receive the truth and speak the truth. And that process is what brings freedom, really. You'll know the truth, and the truth will make you free. And that was the process I was walking through at that time. So that's what that dream's about.
It's a powerful one. I'm not gonna lie, like it's hard for me to read your story, and the listeners will soon find out.
Mhm.
Um, Before we get into that, when you have such an incredible dream, what's your next step? Like,
Yeah,
what do you do with that? You're like, God, what is this? And yeah, what do you do when you have such a
yeah,
significant dream like that? Do you tell your spouse? Do you tell your friends? Do you tell your pastor? Do you sit on it?
yeah.
What did you do?
Well, I've had several of those, especially during that time in my life. And what I usually do is write them all out as much as I can remember. I write them down. And usually I can tell they're from God because they don't leave me. You know how you wake up and you've had a dream, but you can't quite remember it? Well, these were not like that. They stayed with me, and I could sit down even hours later and write it out. But I wrote it all out, and then I just start praying, like, what are you trying to say to me in this dream? Like, this is obviously a message from you. And then I just sit and listen. And as he communicates with me, like he just walked me through that whole dream and explained it all to me. And I just wrote that all out. And then I think I did tell some people about it, but I don't, I think I really just kind of sat with it and meditated on it and really kind of took it all in. And then as I began to actually experience the freedom that came from uprooting all those lies and getting rid of them, then it was like, wow, that dream has come true for me. And now I can share it with other people, like in my book. And sometimes I'll share it when I'm speaking or whatever. But, God speaks to us in metaphors all the time. Jesus taught in parables. It's one of the most powerful things that he does is show us things in pictures and in parables and in metaphors so that we can really grab a hold of what he's trying to tell us. So I don't know. It's just, I think it's one of those things he was teaching me. He was revealing to me what he was doing in my heart at the time in my life so I could understand it and grab a hold of it. And now it's something I can use to with others because everybody can relate to that dream. The
Hmm,
concept of that dream is true for all of us, you know?
absolutely.
Yeah.
Part of your story too is taking brave steps and doing some inner healing. And tell us how the sock department at Walmart brought you some healing.
Oh God. Yes. So the sock department at Walmart. I ran into my former pastor in the sock department at Walmart one day. And the backstory there was that I had been a worship leader in his church for 4 years, I think, after being a worship leader at other churches. So I had had a long 10-year history of being a worship leader and 30 years of just playing in churches and being involved in worship. Long history with that ministry. And in his church, I was named the worship pastor, had a title, but it was such a struggle the entire time I was there for different reasons. But the whole thing was not done well as far as him bringing me in. There were already worship leaders in place, but there were several different teams, and he wanted somebody to oversee all of them. And he brought me in to do that. But he didn't tell any of the worship leaders that's what he was doing. And all of a sudden,
Hmm,
here I am. And they're like, who are you? And so from the beginning, there was battles going on, and egos and all this. And it was a struggle. But by the end of the 4 years, there was only one team because it was at the Bible college, and the Bible college had closed down and the students had left. And so we had one team, and I thought we were doing really well. We were gelling. We had good relationships. We'd hang out together. We were friends. And one day the pastor calls me into his office and says, your people on your worship team are calling me and complaining to me about you. And I was
hmm,
like, what? They hadn't said anything to me. And I had been always telling them, like, if you have any issues with anything, please let's share, let's talk about it. I was always conscious of that. Nobody ever did say anything. And he started telling me some of their complaints, and I'm like, that's not true, and that's not true, and that's not true. But I could tell as we were having this
hmm.
conversation that he didn't believe me. He was believing them. And instead of calling us all together to talk it out and get it all straightened out and out in the open, he just decided, well, I'm going to remove you from leadership and they're all staying on the team, but you're out.
Wow.
And that was so devastating. Like, it was one of the deepest hurts I'd ever experienced. It was betrayal of friends. It was rejection of me as a worship leader. It totally wiped out my confidence as far as even a musician. Like, I couldn't even play the piano for a year because every time I sat down to play, I would hear these accusations in my mind and I would think, oh, I suck. Whatever made me think I could do this, you know? And all the things that they had said kept playing in my mind because it never got resolved. Nobody ever like stood up for me. The pastor didn't stand up for me. Everybody had rejected me. It was also attached to what I felt like was my calling. Like, for all those years, I was a worship leader, that was my identity. And when it got ripped out from under me, I felt like I had no idea who I was or what God had called me to or anything. And all this happened before the estate dream and all that stuff. So this was before I had even started into any kind of healing about who I am. And I came home that day from that meeting just weeping and crying. I was a basket case, and I come walking in the door, and my husband, Bob, he'd never seen me like that. He didn't know what happened, and I couldn't speak. I was so upset. And I just went straight to bed, curled up in bed, and he laid there and held me, not knowing what was going on. And I finally was able to tell him what had happened. And of course, he's like, I'm going to go talk to that pastor. I'm like, no, no, no. So I left that church and went to my new church immediately. But it was several years of like working through all of that and learning to forgive, and also allowing the Lord to show me some of the areas of my heart that were not in alignment with him, where my ego had been so attached to being a worship leader. And I had to lay all of that down, but it was really for my good. But when I ran into him that day in Walmart, I had just found out a few days before. I was in the post office, and somebody in my new church told me, who knew the story. He said, your former pastor is going to be speaking at our church on Sunday. And I thought that this was about a year after all this happened, I think, or a year and a half. And I thought I had forgiven him. I thought I had released all of that. But when that person said that to me, instantly everything came back. And I was like, oh no, he can't come and talk to my new church. He'll hurt people there too. And I felt this like incredible sense of responsibility to protect these people from this pastor. And when all these feelings were coming up, I realized I wasn't free of it yet. I hadn't totally forgiven him yet, because all the emotions were still there. All the anger was still there. Everything was still there. So I'm thinking about that and praying through it and like, Lord, help me to completely forgive him because it's still there. And that was the day I saw him in Walmart.
Mm.
And so I see him, he's on his cell phone, which he was always on the phone, no matter where he was. He was on the phone. And I thought, oh, well, I'll just go this other way. And I just tried to avoid talking to him. And he saw me. He gets off the phone, which, first of all, if you knew him, you'd realize what a shock that is. He gets off the phone. He calls to me, Janelle, come here. I'm like, oh, great. So I go over to him, and he starts telling me how sorry he is for everything he had done and how he had treated me. And I didn't expect that. I never expected that. You know how you need to forgive even if they don't ever own up to it. I never expected him to ever own up to it or anything. And it was like this gift God had given me. Like, here, I'm just giving this to you to help vindicate you. And so that whole conversation like really vindicated that I was wronged, because the whole time I kept thinking, well, maybe they're all right. Maybe I'm just terrible at this. And maybe everything they said was true. But no, he said, no, you were awesome. And you were so faithful. And you led our people into worship. And I was wrong. I listened to all these other people and got caught up in, they were musicians. They had music degrees, and I listened to them, and I didn't listen to you. And I'm so sorry. And it was so awesome because it opened up this opportunity for me to tell him, forgive me for holding that against you. and for holding on to anger and resentment against you. And we had the most honest, open, like authentic conversation we'd ever had. And there was such healing in that, so much healing in that. And that in that moment, I was able to completely let go of all of it and totally forgive him. And from then until today, I can think about that whole thing and think about him and feel nothing but just love for him. I can pray for him and really mean it. Like I want him to be well and to prosper. There's no resentment anymore, nothing. It was just the most awesome gift I think God could have ever given me in the sock department at Walmart. It was incredible. And then he came to our church that Sunday and spoke, and I didn't have any of those feelings of, oh no. It was like, I was just really, he had a word for me in church. It was a beautiful word and just blessed everybody. He was a very prophetic type of pastor. So he always had words of prophecy to speak over people. And I felt completely released from any resentment or anger or bitterness or anything. So it was really, really amazing.
I'm so glad that's how that story ends, because you'd hope there's some forgiveness and redemption and love within the church and the Christian community. So thank you for
Right?
highlighting that.
Yeah.
It shouldn't be the anomaly, and I'm glad we can celebrate that really hard moment, deep wound that, as you described, a ball, uncontrollable emotions, which was not like you, and trying
Yeah.
to work through that. And so you would think
Yeah.
that
It
this is
was a
enough for
beautiful
a book. This
moment.
is
And
enough for a
I
story
learned a lot.
of this. Yeah, yeah, I'm glad you did, and I was just gonna say, like, that just hearing what we've heard so far is enough for a book, and have an appreciation for this amazing transformation story of this woman who always wanted to be a teacher, who does become a teacher, who does some entrepreneurial things, who decides that I'm gonna wake up in my life, and take control, and get rid of these squatters in my life, and actually start to be bold and go on, a new direction and become a professional coach and write down my story and talk about forgiveness and healing. And we've got a book in itself already, but there's so much more to that, including and share as much as or as little as you want to, but just to give you the
Yeah.
opportunity to share that really hard season of your life that you also had to learn forgiveness in
Yes.
Vegas with your boyfriend.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. So the trauma part of the deeper trauma that I had to go back and revisit and get healing from what happened in my 20s. So, well, probably 19 was when the first thing happened. I was a freshman. No, I was a sophomore in college and was drugged and raped one night by a guy. My roommate and I were just out hanging out talking to some guys in a bar. I remember playing foosball, and next thing I know, I'm waking up in my bed in my apartment, not knowing how I got there, not remembering anything. And this guy's on top of me, but I can't move. And I just am very fuzzy headed. And then I blacked out. And when I woke up in the morning, he was gone, but I realized what had happened. And I was a virgin at the time and planning to stay that way until I got married. And so I realized, oh my gosh, like I just lost my virginity to some guy I don't even know. How terrible of
Mm,
me to allow that to happen. It didn't really occur to me in that moment that he had drugged me. It didn't even cross my mind. I
mm,
didn't think of that. I didn't even ever think of that until 30 years later when I'm going through my healing journey and being counseled and ministered to. And it came up in a conversation that night, came up in a conversation. And the woman that I was working with said, that sounds like you were drugged and raped. Because I was talking about it as if I had allowed this to happen. I had had too much to drink, even though I didn't really drink, or I smoked too much pot or something. And somehow I put myself in this position and I must have
mm,
agreed to it, not
mm,
remembering. And that's how I always thought of that night. And I always thought of myself as being just this despicable person to allow that to happen. That was horrible, and had always put myself down, felt a lot of shame, never talked to anyone about it. And here I am 30 years later telling the story, and the woman's like, you were probably drugged and raped. And I was like,
mm,
what?
mm.
Never once in 30 years had it ever occurred to me. That's one thing that amazes me. But now that I know more about trauma, it makes sense. And so that put me in this place back then of, it was sort of like a trauma fog is how I can describe it. I remember that next day feeling like I couldn't quite make sense of what had happened. I was hearing like my thoughts, and what I was saying to myself was just like, you're nothing but a piece of trash. If that's all a guy wants, like you're just this lowest of the low. And I think a couple days later, I was walking on campus and I saw the guy. I knew who he was. It was like a senior, and it was somebody I'd admired from afar, had a crush on. So I knew exactly who it was. But he
Mm.
walked right by me like I didn't even exist. And that just
Mm.
made me feel even worse. Like, oh, I must be just ugly, fat, whatever, like for a guy to treat me like that, it must be me. So that thought that was
Mm.
one of those squatters that got embedded into my property, into the heart, into the soil of my heart, and got very deeply embedded. And so I believed this about myself.
Mm.
And when you believe something about yourself, it becomes your truth, even if it's not true. So that became my truth and how I saw myself, which led me into one relationship after another of just attracting the same kind of men, because I was in this place of desperately wanting to be validated that I had worth and value as a woman. And so whatever guy would come along and pay attention to me, I would like latch on to that. And it was always the wrong kind of guy. And so then I would just feel worse about myself. So all these relationships, just shame just piled up, piled up, piled up all through my college years. I barely graduated, and I'm in this state. And I go out one night to, it was disco days. So we were disco dancing, and I meet this guy, and he's very charming and just kind of swoops in. And the next thing I know, we're dating, and I'm latched onto him now because he's paying attention to me and he's saying all the right things. Well, he convinces me to leave. We were in Colorado. He convinces me to leave Colorado and drive to California with him, where his sisters lived, because he wanted to move and he didn't have a car. And I was out of school and didn't have a job. So I went along with him. We're driving out there, and on the way, he says, let's stop in Las Vegas for a couple days. I've never been there. I'm like, okay. So we stop in Las Vegas, and a couple days turns into weeks, and then that turns into months. And we don't have any money. So he's like, we got to go get jobs. So I went out and got a job. He did not. And the whole time we're there, he starts this process of priming me, which I didn't realize he was doing, and saying things to me like, you're so beautiful. You are worth so much more than just uh, an hourly job. Like, you have so much more um, I don't know, potential to make a lot of money. And so he's grooming me and taking me out and buying me outfits and all this stuff. And then one night he asks me if I really love him. And I, of course, said, well, yes. I mean, I'm desperate. I'm in this state. Like, I got to hold on to this guy. And he asks me if I would go out and sell my body and make a lot of money, be a prostitute. And I'm like, what? I don't want to do that. And then he just continues to talk to me and talk to me. And he just wouldn't leave it alone. Like, he was very, very good at manipulation and emotional
Mm.
manipulation and mental. And so over time, I ended up agreeing to it. And so for 3 years, I was actually trafficked, but I thought I was just being a prostitute because my boyfriend wanted me to be one. And then that added on a whole new layer of shame. Like, how horrible of a person am I? What kind of a woman would do this? Like, I must be totally like, I'm ruined. I've ruined my life. I'll never be a teacher. Nobody else is ever going to want me. And so I felt trapped in this lifestyle. I didn't know how I could get out of it. I just had no self-worth. I was afraid of him. I was intimidated by him. And I remember thinking, I'm stuck. This is it. This is my life. Until one day when we had a really bad argument. He wasn't usually physically violent, but this day he did get violent, and he had me on the floor. He was choking me, and I almost passed out, and I thought he was going to kill me because his eyes were just like so evil, almost like the devil himself had taken over. But all of a sudden he stopped and he ran out of the apartment. And in that moment,
Mm.
I'm hysterical and crying and sobbing and so afraid. I thought I was going to die. And I don't know what to do or who to turn to, but my natural inclination was just to call my mom. And it was probably midnight or 1 in the morning back here in Virginia. I call her sobbing and weeping and can hardly talk. And I don't know what my poor mom thought when she picked up the phone and heard me. They didn't know what I was doing. And I'm just sobbing. I don't even know what I said. I think I just said, I need to get out of here. I need to get out of here. And she just said, I always tell people I was rescued from trafficking with a prayer and a phone call and a prayer and 2 words. Because my mom said, I just think that Jesus wants you to come home to him and have peace. And the words home and peace were like, oh, I want that. It was just like thirsty ground, like, yes, I was just drawn to those words. I didn't understand anything else she said. I just knew I wanted to feel at home and I wanted peace. And she asked me if I would pray with her. And I did. I prayed the sinner's prayer. I asked the Lord into my heart. I didn't know what I was praying. I just was like, give me this. I want freedom. I want home. I want peace. She told me later she couldn't believe I actually prayed the sinner's prayer and confessed my sins, because I, at that time, and you never would know this about me, knowing me the way you have grown up knowing me, but I was very hardened. I had a very foul mouth. And I was a very hardened person. By that point, I was completely disconnected from my emotions, who I really am. I just operated in this very hardened place. And so when I actually prayed with her and asked the Lord to forgive me and confess that I was a sinner, she was like, I can't believe she's saying this. So wow. Immediately after that prayer, I got off the phone. She said something like, you need to go find a church. And I thought she meant right then at 10 o'clock at night. So I get off the phone. But immediately, though, before I did go out and found a church. I found a Catholic church who was open that night. And I went in the church and just sat there. But as soon as I hung up the phone, it was this physical visitation, feeling, whatever. I know it was the Holy Spirit. At the time, I didn't know what it was. It was just this presence that came in, and I could physically feel it filling me up from my head to my toes. Like it was just this, it was the indwelling of the Holy Spirit. I physically could feel him entering me, and I felt the peace. And I knew in that moment, I'm not going back out to another casino, to another bar stool. I'm not selling my body anymore. I'm done. And I all of a sudden had courage to say no, whereas the moment before I couldn't have. But all of a sudden, I'm strengthened. I'm changed. I knew I was free. So he came back. I went and found a church, walked in the church, felt again like the Holy Spirit just come over me. And I knew I was changed. I knew everything changed, and I was going to go home. And I told him that night, and he was like, he wasn't having it, wasn't believing it. So for the next month, because it took a while to get everything arranged for me to leave, he tried everything he knew to keep me there. It was a real battle spiritually. Like he would tell me, oh, I've lost all our money, so you've got to go out and make it again. Or how can you possibly take money from your poor parents when you could go out and make it in one night? Like, that's terrible. But nothing worked. I just was like, no, I'm done. I'm free of this. I'm not doing this ever again. And so he finally relented, and he actually moved back to Pennsylvania. I moved to Virginia. And this is something that's really, really weird, but just to show you the power of the enemy, we're driving out of Las Vegas that day. And as I'm crossing the border into Arizona, I think it was after Lake Mead, something took hold of my steering wheel, and it just felt like something underneath my hands gripped that steering wheel and turned it like that. And I was going this way, and then I was this way on the shoulder, just like that. And there was a truck driver behind me who pulled over, and he said, I saw your taillights, and then I saw your headlights. Like it was, and I knew I didn't do it. I was just driving along. I had 2 cats in the car, but they were sleeping. Like something gripped my steering wheel and turned my car. And I was like, this is so weird. So in those
Mm.
days, we didn't have cell phones. So we pulled off and found a cell phone. I called my parents, and he was in his car. I was in my car. I called my parents, and they're like talking to each other on the one was on one extension and the other, and they're talking
Mhm.
to each other, and they're like, that must have been the enemy trying to keep her there. And I'm like, what are they talking about?
Yeah.
What are they
Wow.
talking about? But yeah, it was really freaky. And then the rest of the drive home was fine, but it was like a hard month. And then that moment happened. But we came home. I came home to Virginia, and he went up to Pennsylvania. The sad part of this story is that yes, I was free from the prostitution, but I wasn't free internally from all of that. And so I still believed that I was a horrible person. I was still ashamed. I couldn't tell anybody what happened. I didn't tell my parents. I didn't tell anybody. I didn't get any kind of help because I wasn't talking about it. And then he still had a hold on me because who else was ever going to want me because of what I've done? So I can't marry someone else. And he asked me to marry him about a year later. And I thought, well, might as well, because if I ever want to get married, I mean, that's what the logic was going on in my head. And my mom was like, maybe you're just in this habit of being with him. Maybe you should give it more time. But I married
Mm.
him and spent another 6.5 years with this narcissist. And it was rough. There were other things in those 6.5 years that were crazy. I mean, I think there was some mental illness involved as well because of some of the weird stuff that he did. We were homeless for a while. We struggled a lot financially. But finally, around 6.5 years in, by then I had Shauna. So this was her dad we're talking about.
Wow.
And she's 3 years old. And he just packs up and leaves one day, empties our savings account and just leaves. And we were in Massachusetts at the time, far from
What'd
home,
you do?
just leaves us. What did he do?
What
What
do
did
you
I,
do? Yeah.
what did I do? I realized in that moment when I woke up that morning, he claimed that God was sending him out to find whatever. Um,
Mm.
but
Yeah.
instantly God said to me, you're free now. You don't have to stay anymore. You're free. And so I knew the marriage was over. I was by this time stronger in my faith. I was able to speak up more and stand up for myself. And so I called my parents, and eventually it took me a while to get everything arranged, but I moved back home. But here's the really weird thing. He went out to Texas. I don't know why he went to Texas, but he went to Texas and he was involved in a church and got involved in a church and was acting like he was some kind of minister, and he was living with this couple. And they called me one day and they said, oh, your husband's so wonderful. He's an evangelist and he told us how you guys were praying about coming out here and all this stuff. And I'm like, no, no, this is what happened. He's drained our
Wow.
savings account and he left us. And they were like, what? So he had been lying to them. And anyway, they kicked him out. And he ended
Yeah.
up back at my parents' house eventually in Virginia. And so when I came home, he was actually living here in Blacksburg. And
Really?
yeah, and thought that we were going to get back together. And my parents were being fooled by him too. And I
Mm.
remember being on the phone with my mom one day, and she was like, I was so angry. I was just so angry that he was doing this. And I was telling her, kick him
Mhm.
out of the house. What are you doing letting him live there? He left us. He abandoned us. And she's like, I'm worried about your anger. And I'm like, ah. But as soon as I got home, he walked in the door after I had gotten there, and she said instantly she could see the real him because he had been fooling them and acting like this wonderful person. But when he walked in the door and his attitude toward me, she saw it then, and she realized, oh, this is not what I thought. um,
Mhm.
and so I told him, I said, I'm not going to live with you. I'm not going to go anywhere with you because you left us, and my daughter needs a secure place. So we're staying here. And you
Yeah.
can stay here too, but you can't live here. You've got to go get your own place. And if you want to stay, but I'm not going anywhere because he was going to go back to Vegas. He finally did. He went back to Vegas, and that was it. We divorced. But that was from the time the rape happened until that happened. It was a good 10 years total of just trauma after trauma after trauma. And me not realizing That was another big realization for me, was that I was even a trauma survivor. I'd never thought of any of that as trauma. I just thought it was just my
Mm.
life, you know? And so you fast forward 30 years, 30 plus years, when I finally start walking this out and peeling back all the layers and beginning to understand what had actually happened, comparing to what I believed, tearing up the squat, getting rid of the squatters again.
Mm.
I was like, oh, I was trafficked. I didn't think I
Mm.
was trafficked because I wasn't like kidnapped and drugged and kept prisoner somewhere. I could have left any time. I just didn't realize I could leave. But then I started reading about trafficking, and the definition, the actual official federal government definition of a trafficking victim is oftentimes in a relationship, what they think is a romantic relationship. In fact, almost 40% of trafficking victims are lured into it through a romantic relationship. And the person primes the victim really over a period of time. And then they're into it and they don't realize that they're being trafficked, just like me. And so when I read that, I was like, oh my gosh, wow. I
Mhm.
never realized that. And that helped me to heal, because then I could stop being ashamed of myself. That was where the biggest, I think, the most in depth healing happened, when I could look at my younger self. There was a picture. In fact, it's over here on my shelf. It was put away in a drawer. It was from during that time when I was being trafficked. And I could never look at
Mm.
that picture without feeling this load of shame, like, ugh. And my husband now found it one day and put it up. He was like, "You were so beautiful." And I'm like, ugh, yuck. And I had to stick it back in the drawer. But now I can look at it and love myself and see that younger me. And instead of being ashamed of her, I was able to finally be able to embrace her and realize, oh my gosh, you were a victim. You were trafficked. You were raped. You were taken advantage of by these men. And it isn't who you are. None of that stuff is who you are. Who you
Mm.
are is a woman of great value and worth in God's eyes. And this is what he's created you for, like what I'm walking in now, And so that's why I wrote the book, because I wanted women especially to know that, because the statistics are very high. It's something like 4 out of 5 women are attacked in some way, or harassed, or, sexually assaulted. And the number of people being trafficked now is much worse than even when I went through it. And it's just horrendous, to be able to empower people to know that, those things did not determine who you are or your worth and value. That was somebody else, doing something to you, but who you are is so valuable. And so I really wanted people to be able to know they have a voice and they have value, and you can, you can forgive yourself. That was the biggest thing, is forgiving myself. And you can forgive the people that hurt you and be free of this. And you can walk out on center stage of your life as you, and be the star of your own story. To me, that just means being connected again to who I am at the core of my being able to walk into that disrepair house and it's all fixed, and it's nothing, there's no shame anymore. And to be able to own that part of myself, like, yeah, that did happen, because for so long I just wanted to ignore it and act like it never happened. And part of my healing journey was owning that story. Like, it did happen. It really did happen. But it wasn't my fault. I was manipulated, and the person who did that knew exactly what he was doing. And I
Mm.
was just this vulnerable woman who had already been injured and was just desperate to be loved, And this happens so often. It's crazy. That's why I
Thank
wrote
you
the
for
book.
Yes. Thank you for writing the book, and thank you for being willing to share that story. I don't take it lightly because it's not fun to relive trauma. It's not fun to go through that again. So thank you for being willing to share the emotions behind it and
Yeah.
to um, I mean, as I mentioned, that section that talked about my story is dramatic and shocking to some, I was like, yeah, it
Yeah.
is.
Yeah.
It's hard, but thank you for writing it down. And the process of writing it down, I'm sure, was just helpful for you to once again
Mhm.
go through that trauma and not avoid
Mhm.
it. I know that there was
Mhm.
a section in the book too that you realize like, oh, I actually don't feel emotion. Like everyone around me is having all these
Mhm.
emotions during this maybe this like
Mhm.
really emotional scene of a movie, and I'm not
Yeah.
feeling it. And maybe there's something there. And
Yeah.
now that you've done this work, I'm sure that you're able to enjoy the
Mhm.
emotions of life in a
Mhm.
positive way, and you're able to do it with your clients
Yeah.
now.
Yeah.
And I did want to ask, was it hard to share the story with family before, compare sharing the
Mhm.
story with family versus
Mhm.
writing a public book.
Yeah. Well, first of all, what you're saying, writing it out was much harder and it was a much different process, but it brought even more healing and revelation that I didn't expect when I started writing. It took me 4 years to actually write all of it, because there were times where I
Mhm.
couldn't. But one of the biggest blocks to me being able to talk about it was Shauna. So Shauna's my daughter, as you know, and it was her
Mhm.
dad. So when she was little, like all those years, like when he left, she was 4. And so how could I tell people how could I share? I was so afraid that if I shared this story, it would get back to her and make her feel really bad that it was her dad. And maybe even she would start attaching it to herself or some way, like think, well, if my dad was that way, maybe I'm that way. Um,
Yeah,
and then even for her to like, what would she think of me? So all those things played into it. So
sure.
I didn't share it. I think I shared it in confidence with maybe one or two people somewhere in there. But when she was old enough, then I was able to talk to her about it. And she already had figured out, she was probably in her teens by then. She had already figured out what kind of person he was without me having to say anything. I never put him down in front of her or told her he was a horrible person or anything. She figured it out by spending time with him that there's something not right here. And she really didn't want to be around him very much. There just wasn't that relationship. And so when I finally did tell her, she was fine with it. Um, she didn't get angry with me or be ashamed of me or anything. She just took it all in and was like, "Wow, mom, that's." And then I asked her, especially when I was writing the book, "Are you okay with me writing this book?" She's like, "Yeah, totally." So the book is
Mm.
dedicated to her.
Yeah.
She's such a big part of my journey of healing too. Just and if it wasn't, I wouldn't have her if it wasn't for that. So it's like the gift in the middle of all of that was Shauna. And then, the rest of my family, like, yeah, there was some, like, my dad, I had told my parents way before I ever wrote it, but I didn't tell it like with all the revelation that I had from going through the healing process. Um, I think I probably talked to my mom more about it than my dad. So but I had told him, and when my book was published, I gave him a copy and he read it for the first time. And he told me later, he's like, I didn't know all that happened to you. It's okay, Dad. And then he started really feeling bad because he didn't
Mm.
know and he wasn't aware of it and he didn't rescue me from it. There was even a point in time where he came to visit me when I was in Las Vegas. And I remember that day clearly because I was so desperate to have my daddy's love, that I actually crawled up into his lap as a 24 or 5-year old, sat on his lap and just wanted to be loved,
Mm.
unconditionally by my dad. I was so desperate for that. And I remember thinking, like, what am I doing? This is weird. But it was just like almost like this primal thing. And I asked
Yeah.
him, I said, do you remember that day when I crawled up in your lap? And he goes, yeah, I thought it was a little strange, but,
Oh,
and
wow.
then I had to really talk through that with him and just say, it wasn't your fault. You didn't know. I didn't tell you. How would you know? It's okay, Dad. And then one of my sisters said even though she knew what had happened, when she read the book, she cried through the whole thing.
Yeah.
And then his sister, which really surprised me, he has 3 sisters, and one of them called me after she got the book and she said, I have to talk to you about, and she was crying as she was talking to me, like, I didn't know. And she would come and visit us a lot in Vegas. And we told her that I was a prostitute. And she thought, oh, well, that's just their choice. I guess she's choosing to do this. I'm not going to judge her. And she never thought anything more about it. She said, I never realized he was doing that to you. And she just cried and felt really bad. And we just talked through that whole thing, and then I think she had to walk through the process of forgiving her brother. But and I know a lot of people are afraid of telling their story because of the impact it's going to have on their friends and their family when they find out. But and there are situations where you do want to be careful, because if it puts somebody in danger or in any way harms people, you have to be careful. But it is important to be able to tell your story for you, to
Mm-hmm.
process it and get it out. Not that you have to go and blast it to the world like I do now, or write it out in a book, but to be able to tell it in confidence in a safe place where you can process through it. That is very healing. I realized I needed to, I mean, God told me that he wanted me to write this book. He told me this for years. I have journals, pages and pages and pages of him saying to me, you've got to get this book out there. Like I'm going to use it. I'm going to use it to heal so many women. Like, I want you to write this book. So that's why I wrote it. It was not just for me. It was a tool that God, was going to use. And, I finally got to that place of like, okay, I'm just going to release this, and it's going to impact people in different ways, but that's okay, because, they can, like my sister-in-law and my sister and my dad and my mom, like all of them process my other siblings. I'm not sure how. I know another sister's told me it affected her, but it enables that conversation, to have that conversation. And it enables them, to, I think, be free enough to be real with themselves. Like it just brings everything out from the closet. Like anything you keep in hiding because you're ashamed, that's a tool of the enemy. Are we back? There we go. That's a tool of the enemy to keep
Yeah.
you in bondage, you know. So even though it was hard in certain instances, but I think I had just gotten to the place where I realized that it's okay, and we can talk about this. Let's get it out in the open.
Thank you for getting out in the open, and it's a great book. Thank you for sharing it. It's really inspiring, and like I said, I've got some extra chapters to go. So, how are you taking all this and serving others now? Like, so I always like to
Mm-hmm.
talk about how, you know, you've talked about like how you provided for yourself with this healing and
Mm-hmm.
this deep healing, and your work now. Why don't you, tell our listeners, what is the work that you're doing now with life coaching, with coaching coaches, and how people could,
Yeah.
connect with you if they want to and learn more from you.
Yeah, sure. So, I've been coaching now for 10 years, and this is my 10th year. I started off focusing on women and confidence, and kind of like the same journey I was on in midlife, figuring out what I really wanted to do with my life, and being able and enabling them to work through whatever they need to work through to really love themselves. But now I work with coaches who are building a business, because I worked with a mentor for 3.5 years or 4 years that helped me to put a structure around my business, the business model that I was lacking. And I saw how many coaches, I've been a mentor coach and a success coach with new coaches for years, and I've seen the struggle of being able to be prosperous and have a business that you can sustain, that, is can provide, because it's really not an easy business to create, and a lot of coaches don't know how to do the business side of things. And so in the last few years, I'm like, I really want to help coaches build thriving, prosperous businesses and teach them this model so that they don't give up, because coaching is so powerful and they have so much to give. And coaches always want to help. They're helpers. That's why they go into coaching. They want to transform people's lives. That's what they're all about. They are afraid to ask for money because they just want to help people, like all the things that coaches work through. So along the way, I learned how important it is to learn how to tell your story, how to speak, and share in all kinds of different ways so that people find you. And that's one thing that coaches have trouble with because they don't know how to get themselves out there. And so I focus on helping them to get their messages together, to host events, learn how to speak, get themselves on podcasts and summits so that people know that they're there and start coming to them. And so that's kind of like my initial work with coaches. And then if they sign up for my mastermind program, we work for a whole year in building their business model from doing events and speaking, and then establishing their community, and building their group programs and one-on-one programs. Uh, how do you make an offer? How do you make those sales calls and build your email list and all the pieces. And so I
Mhm.
do it in a very step-by-step method that I learned, and it works really well. So I've just now transitioned into that in the last couple years, and I'm really, really enjoying it. And I really want to see coaches prosper because the work that they do is powerful. So I actually have my own app. I don't know if I told you this. I have an app.
No, tell us more.
Yeah. It's called Emerging Life Coaching, same name as my business. And in my app, there's courses and videos. There's some things you pay for, some things are free. There's a weekly call I do every Monday for coaches called the Speak Easy Cafe. And it's free and it's on Zoom. People just come and I teach a little bit on a topic and then they can ask questions. Well, all of those are in my app. There's articles in there and I'm adding to it all the time. So that's one way people can connect with me is just download my app, sign in to be a member. You can be a free member and have access to lots of things. Eventually, I'm going to have a membership site where you can have access to more things. And then, of course, I have my regular website, which is emerginglifecoaching.com. So they can contact me there as well. And I'm always happy to have conversations with people. And if they feel like anything I've shared is something that can help them, I do work from my book and that whole story. I do work with women still. Um, I actually volunteer with, we have a local ministry here. It's a recovery center called Eagle's Nest. And they have a home for men and they just started a home for women about a year ago. And so I've been volunteering with them and I took my book, gave them all a copy of my book. We've been talking about things in there and just as a coach helping, in any way I can. Um, I think I'm going to start working with them to help them write their stories, which is going to be super exciting. So, and I created a course that goes with my book. So I've taken some women through that, like helping them to, because my book has a process. You can walk through the same process I did. It has a workbook, has exercises. So it's really not just my story, but it's like, here's how you can also find freedom. And then I created a course where, I haven't run it live for a while, but um, when I find that women really, if I can get a group together, I'll do it again. But it's a place where women can talk out things that they have never been able to talk about before, and just kind of go through that process together instead of just reading about it. Sometimes it's hard to actually walk it out by yourself. So there's that as well. I haven't been doing that lately, but that's something I've done in the past and probably will do again.
A lot of good work. Well,
Yeah.
and this is actually really helpful for me as you talked about, like, it is hard to read the story, and then it's been therapeutic to just hear you share about it and how you've developed into the coach you are and how you're using it to help others with it.
Yeah.
So I know that there's more that you can share, and I'll just begin to wrap up by saying thank you so much for sharing. And it just is a reminder to me, and it's so humbling where we think we know people, but we just put people in a box. Like, oh, that's Mrs. Anderson, my
Yeah.
teacher growing up, and my my mom, my mom's best friend, and like all these
Yeah.
you know box that we put people in, and
Hmm.
just to appreciate everyone has such a rich story. So thank you for sharing some of your story today.
Yeah. Thank you for having me and allowing me to share it. I always enjoy that place, when people give me that space to share. I would say I agree. Everybody has a story. Everybody has something that's of huge value to others. We don't always realize it. We don't always realize how much value there is in the things we've walked through and come out on the other side. So I always encourage people, to get in touch with that and learn how to tell your story and learn how it can help others, like see the value in that. That was for me such a huge eye opener. The first time I ever shared the trafficking story in a public setting was at a women's retreat, and I was so scared. But I knew God wanted me to speak the words out loud in a public place. I just knew it was something. It was a part of my journey, and He wanted me to do it, and I did. And afterwards, the thought came to me, "Oh no, I've blown it now. They're never going to want to talk to me again. Why did I share that?" But then woman after woman at that retreat kept coming up to me the whole weekend, thanking me. And they said that in the small groups, they were starting to open up because of my story, because of me sharing my story. It gave them permission to start opening up to find their own healing. And I was like, oh, that's the reason He wants me to share my story. It's not about my story. I always felt like, it's going to shock people. They're going to feel bad. Why would I want to share this story? But that's not what it's about. It's not about me sharing a shocking, sad story. It's saying, hey, I went through this and now I'm on the other side and you can get there too, and you can learn to be real with yourself and be vulnerable and be open so you can find your own healing, because I've been there and I know that you can come through it on the other side. Like that's what it's about. So I would encourage people to.
I mean, come on. That's a great message to share. So keep sharing it with your megaphone that you had in that vision. And and thank you for coming on the show today to share. I just want to say thank you.
Well, thank you for having me. And it's been really a lot of fun to be on your podcast, Justin. So cool.
Oh, I just love it. And then remind people how to connect with you. Is it emerginglifecoaching.com is the best place to start?
Yeah, I mean, you can go to the website and there's a contact form there that you can just request a discovery session or a strategy session with me. People can email me too. It's just Janelle@emerginglifecoaching.com. And you can also download my app. So there's multiple ways to reach me.
Great.
Yeah.
Well, we will put all that in the show notes, as they say in podcast land. So yeah, that's great. All right. Well, I think that's a wrap. Thank you, Ms. Janelle. Right. This has been wonderful.
All right. Thank you so much. I will see you, I'm sure, soon.
Yes. Thank you for listening to this episode. And I want to provide you with one more thing before you go, called Always Provide. Would you enjoy getting some encouragement each Wednesday to help you get over hump day? If so, subscribe to our free newsletter at clthomasfellowship.org. It's easy to sign up, and it's sort of a diary of ways that I'm personally learning to provide and serve more like Jesus. I share inspiring books, scripture, stories, and even products that are helping me to always provide. So if you want to try it out, go to clthomasfellowship.org/newsletter and sign up. So until next time, keep serving others like Jesus. Bless and protect.